I'm more explicit than you are. I'm like, what you're doing here is this. You look like an idiot. And I actually
Hmm.
say you look like an idiot. And it tends to work, especially with men.
You can try it here if you want.
No, that's okay. You're not, I don't need to. I would if I had to.
It is on.
Hi, everybody. Today I'm talking with Isaac Chotiner. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker who's gone viral for his contentious conversations with people like former White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre and legal scholar Cass Sunstein. I like what Isaac is doing, and one of the things I'm going to do this year is focus on people whose work I like. And of course, since it's the beginning of the year and we do interviews all year long, I want to talk to someone who I think is one of the better interviewers these days. In fact, one of the best. He's doing a lot of things that other people aren't, which is sort of celebrating his own idiosyncratic style and also really drilling down and getting real answers out of people, something I try to do and not always successful at doing. And he often is. This is a fascinating conversation with a master interviewer and someone I respect a lot. So stick around. Isaac, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
So, do you know why you're here?
No.
Because you're one of my favorite interviewers, and I interview for a living, and I've decided to please myself in 2026 by
Well, it's
talk.
very nice of you to say.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about your craft and a bunch of things. And one of the things, I was at dinner last night with a lot of people, and they are also fans of yours, but they don't know anything about you, like
Hmm.
at all, which is really interesting. And of course, I'm like a promiscuous blabber about myself and my family and everything. So I want to talk a little bit about that, but let's talk about the craft itself first, if you don't mind. You have a reputation for getting powerful people to tie themselves into verbal and intellectual knots on the record. It's earned you a pretty intimidating nickname, the interview assassin. I don't know. Are you amused by that characterization, or does it miss something about your approach?
It's fine, I guess. I try not to do the majority of my interviews, that type of interview, which tends to kind of be the ones that go, more viral on Twitter or whatever else. But it's nice that people are reading and enjoying the work, I guess.
Hmm. And do you think about it when you're doing it, or do you feel like you have to live up to that, or not at all?
No, no, not so much. I guess maybe I kind of have an aggressive style in terms of asking questions, but it's just sort of the way I do interviews, I guess. So I don't think about it consciously too much.
Do you think it's because most people do interviews not in that way, or that are too soft? I think that's the case, but
Well, there's certainly a lot of interviews that are too soft, but I think that there are ways of doing there are different ways of doing interviews that are hard hitting or whatever else. I think one advantage that I have is that I get to do a lot of interviews over the phone. I do some in person and I do some with video over Zoom, but a lot of them are phone interviews where I'm just talking to the person, I'm not seeing their face.
oh,
And for me, that's much easier to do an interview that can be confrontational or,
mhm.
there's like the old joke about how it's easier to, break up with your spouse over the phone or whatever else. It's
It
easier to
is.
have a confrontational interview. So I think for those types of interviews, I'm fortunate to be able to do them over the phone.
And what do you pick that as a thing? Because most people don't do those anymore, right? They do
Yeah,
either.
no, I prefer them. I mean, if it depends on what the interview you're doing. I tend to think of interviews as being kind of one of two categories. This is
Mhm.
obviously very broad. The
Sure.
first is you're interested in the person you're talking to, and the second is you're interested in their expertise. And if a news event happens and I'm interviewing someone about, a coup in Turkey or something,
Mhm.
um, it's usually the person I will interview. It's not that people are interested in what this historian of Turkey, what their personal life is like, or what their office looks like. They're interested in the news they have to offer, the analysis they have to offer. And then there are interviews where you're talking to Jonathan Franzen or Zadie Smith or whoever else. And I think people then are more interested in kind of a little bit of scene, a little bit of, what this person was like, where you met, so on and so forth. So I tend to think of the interviews in one of those two ways.
And do you choose who you interview? How much input and how does that happen? Talk a little bit about the process.
Yeah, I talked to my editor, who's a wonderful editor named Micah at the New Yorker, and he and I talk about it. I get ideas from my boss, from other editors at the magazine, from colleagues. I'm always asking people, my friends, who would be an interesting person to talk to. What's a subject
Mhm.
matter I should be looking into?
Yeah. Is it strikes your fancy? Because some of them are off the beaten track. Some of them are people that are in the news,
Yeah.
essentially.
It's some combination of what's in the news, things that personally interest me. I think if you read my interviews, you get some sense of subjects that I'm particularly interested in. And then, yeah, just things that seem interesting to me that someone brings to my attention, and it's the way I get a lot of the stuff.
And then you figure that out. Let's talk a little bit about your influences in the genre. You mentioned David Marchese. I like him very much. The New York Times is someone whose work you like, though he's that's someone you like. Talk about what I would say. Tom Snyder. I know it sounds crazy from way back when. You don't know who. Maybe you do, or
Of
maybe you
course,
don't.
he was after Letterman. I used to watch his show all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, back in the sort of the early days when I was a kid, I know it sounds crazy, but I always enjoyed Barbara Walters. There's all kinds of people, like different things that they did, that made me laugh. Obviously, Dick Cavett was a big influence on me because I'm old. Who do you look up to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Tom Snyder's an interesting one. I hadn't thought about him, but he would have these absolutely fascinating interviews. One person who I think is actually an incredible interviewer, and I've thought about trying to not mimic because that's for obvious reasons, is Howard Stern, who
Excellent.
has an ability to get things from his guests that I don't feel like I totally understand how he does it. But I've thought that there's something. I think it's something about the kind of vulnerability he shows, the self-deprecation he shows. There are other aspects of Howard Stern which I'm less interested in mimicking, but there's something about how he talks to people of vulnerability that I think really lets
Mhm.
people open up, and I think that that's I don't go into my personal life when I'm interviewing
No,
someone,
you
but
don't. Yeah,
trying to show that vulnerability is I think important.
which is kind of impossible without being personal, right? I mean, it's in some
Yeah,
ways.
I mean, you can be self-deprecating, you can make a joke, which I think, my theory about making jokes with people you're interviewing, to start things off is they either think it's funny, which is good, or they don't think it's funny, but therefore they kind of look at you with a certain amount of pity, which is also a
Mhm.
source
No,
of vulnerability.
that's one of your
S
tricks.
so, I think there are ways to do it,
Mhm.
so that would be another example.
And what would be your trick there? Because that's a trick, right? I have a bunch of
Is that
them,
a
but
trick? Oh,
it's
I don't mean that I'm, like, writing down jokes before an
n
interview to come
no,
up with.
no, I'm
Yeah.
saying is that something you think works for you, or what works best for you?
I think trying to set a lightish tone to start off, is important, yeah. It doesn't wanna seem too severe.
Severe at the beginning. At the
Yeah.
beginning. So let's talk a little bit more about what makes a good interview and your style. We're going to talk about your reputation in a minute, but tell us more about the process because we have a process here. I have had one for a long time. It's changed over time. Um, and again, you don't do as many high profile figures. As you said, they're more informational with an expert on the subject. Um, what do you think makes an expert interview a success for you? And talk about beforehand because I don't think people know. Everyone's always asking, "Do you prepare before?" And I'm like, "Well, obviously we." Like, what do you think? We just like sit down and just start blabbing away. I mean, I guess they're used to cable news or something. I'm not sure why they think nobody prepares. But talk about your prep.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I should start by saying, it's very different for a subject that you have some knowledge of or versus something that you're kind of coming into fresh because of the news. And so, some interviews take a lot longer than other interviews to prep because just my knowledge of the subject is, during COVID, I was doing a lot of interviews in the first year, and I'm pretty stupid about medicine and science and all these things. And
Mhm.
I thought that at least in that case, a lot of people were coming to this subject fresh and didn't know much about it, and so I would sort of play the role of not
Smart
play the role.
person,
No, 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 not the smart person, the person who didn't know
right?
and, didn't know what was going on and was asking these experts questions,
Hmm.
just the way average people, I'm being one of them, thought about, were wondering what was going on. And then there's subjects where you know more about, and, so it's easier, in most cases. But, for me, I think part of what I try and do with these things is on subjects I'm interested in, be constantly reading and trying to find people who I think are saying interesting things about these subjects. And so then when I decide to do an interview about, I have sort of a list of people or people in mind to turn to.
Mhm. Do you feel vulnerable in those moments to admit you're not an expert? Is that because a lot of reporters try to come off as a lot smarter than they are. I've always noticed when in fact they aren't. Or I don't know is never used, and I do it a lot. I'm like, I don't know. Like, tell
Yeah,
me.
I think one aspect of sort of whether you're a commentator or a writer is that part of journalism is you sort of inherently come across as knowing more than you do. I remember I reviewed a book about the history of sugar. This was probably 15 or 20 years ago, and I remember my grandmother saying to me, like, "I had no idea that you knew so much about the history of sugar." And I said, "Well, I don't. This is just what happens when you review a book and you can sound that way. It's sort of it's all bullshit to some degree." Um, but no, I think journalists should be upfront about things that they don't know, and I think that as I said, I think that there's some things that I don't know that I would not want to do interviews about because I would just feel too deep in the weeds. I feel like I couldn't do it. And then I think in other areas, like I said, kind of when COVID was starting, I think there's a way to try and use your lack of knowledge and say, most people reading this don't have great knowledge of it. And I'm going to kind of use that to inform readers in some way.
You also have to, though, ask the smart. You can't be dumb, right? You can't be someone who has no curiosity. It's a curious person,
Yes,
right?
yes,
Yeah,
that's a good distinction,
right.
I guess,
Yeah.
is curiosity versus some deep insight or knowledge of the situation. And so I think that that's a way of both connecting with people, but it's also a way that your prep work can be helpful to you.
hmm So, in an interview with the Columbia Journalism Review, you said that one of the reasons you really like the Q&A format is because you're able to bring both reporting and opinion. Talk about that, the distinction for people who don't think about it that way.
Well, I mean, I'm lucky enough to be able to do, as are you, to do interviews where I don't think people are confused about what my opinion is on various subjects, about the Trump administration or so on. And so I can ask questions that I think make it clear what my point of view is and not feel like that's violating the terms of the interview. But, to get to a point where I'm asking those questions, it often requires a certain amount of reading or reporting or talking to other people about what those questions will be. And so I like the fact that I can kind of do sort of traditional some at least traditional reporting things before an interview to sort of get my prep, and then in the course of the interview um can put that to use and also do it in a way where I don't feel like I need to sort of hide what my opinion is in a way that which is great in some ways but can also feel stifling.
But we talk about why opinion's important to you because it also puts you in a position of potentially coming off as partisan. I answer these questions all the time. I'm like, well, I think it's fair to the readers. Do you think it turns off readers, or I think it brings them in myself? But
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. I'm sure it turns off some people and brings in other people. I just think that broadly speaking, it's easy. This is not about a specific point of view or a specific subject. Allowing your own perspective to not sort of ask all these questions completely neutrally just allows for a broader range of questions and ways of asking the question, which I think makes for a more interesting interview.
right, right. So the idea is having a point of. I mean, I think hiding a point of view has always been the mistake, right? Of a lot. I mean, jokingly, the side of fair and balance. There's no such thing, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you can't be fair if you don't. I think Christiane Amanpour was. I think she said truthful, not neutral, essentially, which I thought was a pretty good way to to figure it out. But when you're doing that, I think you get more trust. At the
Hmm.
same time, when you do that with subjects, have they taken advantage of that from your point of view?
In what sense?
Meaning, like, oh, you don't like Trump, and therefore you're not going to listen to me. For
Oh,
example, he's a perfect person. That's sort of Rorschach test on everybody.
Oh, that's interesting. Not so much. I think, people who would feel that way probably make that assumption before they start talking to me, just thinking, "Oh, he's, working for the New Yorker or whatever else." And so I think at this point those assumptions are I mean, I will say, it's gotten harder and harder to get Republicans to talk in
I
the
agree.
10 plus years I've been interviewing. And I think most of those reasons are not the fault of the media and are probably inevitable given the way politics is going.
hmm
But, there are other times where I think, maybe if I had fewer opinions about something in a previous interview that, maybe someone has seen that it would be easier to get this person to talk and I regret it. But as I said, I think most of the reasons for that are way beyond one person or one news institution's ability to fix or
So
change.
how do you convince, say, I agree with you on the Republicans. Some do, though. Some are, but you're right, are harder to talk to and talk to in a normal way, actually, with in an honest conversation. I think it's a large term, but how do you convince them to come on then?
I just It's a good question. I mean, the truth is that the most people that I try to get to come on who don't, I'm not dealing with them, I'm dealing with their people. But I just try and be honest and say you hope for a good conversation. And I mean, the thing is that you can't promise things that you can't promise. You can't say things are going to be off limits. You can't. So there's a limited amount of things you can do. You can just say, I really think this would be an interesting conversation, and I hope you'll, just try and be sincere about it. It would be easier if you could say, we're not going to talk about X, and then you talk about X, but we don't do that. So yeah.
Yeah. What's interesting is I try to reach the person themselves rather than their people. I don't like talking to the people most of the time, or the initial outreach is to the person. I can find their phone number or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's great. I actually prefer text if possible. If you can get the person's phone number, just it feels more informal. Goes back to what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about research. You talked. The main thing is research, and you do a lot of another element of a good interview is the conversation, as you just noted. You used the word conversation, which I think in a good interview is a good conversation. But it means as an interview, you have to be flexible. So do you when you obviously write questions beforehand versus letting the conversation flow organically, but talk about how you shift in that way.
Yes, I don't actually write all my questions out beforehand for most interviews. There's some times that I'm doing an interview that I'm worried about how it's going to go, or that, go off the rails, or I need to quote specific things to the person. And so I write out very specific questions. Other times I just have kind of notes in front of me with things I want to ask and some structure for the interview, because I hope that the form the interview takes, like a story, will have sort of a beginning, middle, and an end. But I try and keep it flexible enough that I'm not just reading questions to them, because for me that feels a little bit stifling. And my hope is that I've kind of done enough background work that I can feel comfortable. You know, uh, talking without having to look at the questions. I will say there are some times where I'm doing a subject that I'm not a great expert in. A news event has just occurred, some Supreme Court decision that I'm talking to a lawyer about. And just because I want to quote the decision accurately, and I want to phrase things a certain way, that I will write it all out. But it's not always the case.
Interesting. You don't have the script itself
No,
necessarily.
not usually. No.
Yeah, because you're probably listening actually for something interesting. I think a lot of people don't go off their scripts essentially. But they won't. It's not really the follow up question because that's a sort of weird canard. You didn't ask a follow up question. So you're not listening in the first place in order to
Yeah.
move forward.
Well, no, I mean, I should say, though, about the listening thing is obviously I try and pride myself on listening, not just in my personal conversations with friends or whatever else, but also in
See,
interviews.
that's where I don't try to listen. But go ahead.
Oh, good, good, good. But whenever I'm typing up an interview, whenever I'm transcribing it, I'm always surprised that there are things that, no matter how close I thought I was paying attention, there are things that I missed, or nuances that I missed. And so that's one of the things I actually like about transcribing stuff, is that it makes you realize that you're paying attention less close than you think, or at least I
Right, that
am.
there's something that pops out into it. Your Q&As, for people who don't know, are printed, but you used to host a podcast for Slate called I Have to Ask. Talk about the pros and cons of written versus audio, and do you feel a push towards being forced back into audio, I guess?
I haven't felt it yet, but
Yeah.
maybe I'm expecting the phone call from my bosses at any
January
moment.
1st. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Video is it.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't gotten the push yet, but maybe it'll come. I didn't love doing a podcast just because, going into a studio and the kind of extra stuff around it didn't particularly interest me. But I gather it's easier now even than when I was
It
doing
is.
it 6 years ago. Yeah.
Mhm.
But 8 years ago, whatever it was. But I like that people can hear the conversation. That part of it is fun. And I think that the written is, I love doing the written stuff. I mean, the thing you do have to keep in mind is that or I always try and keep in mind is, written words can be misleading. People can give responses that, if when typed out literally, seem hostile when they're not. People say things that
Tone.
don't make tone
Yeah.
gets lost.
Yeah.
People have weird phrases. People say, yeah, no,
Mhm.
like things like that, which if
Mhm.
written out, yeah, no, doesn't make any sense. But you know what they mean when you're talking to them. So they're all these things are, worth keeping in mind. And but to me, that's an interesting part of the Q&A is how to have as much of what we actually said while not being misleading in any way. And so that editing challenge I actually find quite interesting.
Do you ever feel it puts you on your back foot? Because a lot of people say, "That's not what I said. It's not how I said it." Like, when you put the
I haven't
stuff.
had that really happen. I mean, there was one guy who said that the interview was more or less fake, I think, but I guess that is always a concern. I mean, but again, it's one reason you have to tape the interviews.
Right, exactly. So do you feel like you wanna go into audio now that it's sort of the thing, or video is really the thing now?
No, definitely not.
Definitely not. You're gonna stay retro in that
Well, I
regard.
I mean,
I'm
I don't
teasing.
know. It's got to make a living, so we'll see what. But we'll see.
We'll see. So let's talk about your interviewing style just a little more. As I mentioned earlier, you had a reputation for being a tough interview. In the fall, you had some contentious conversations with legal scholar Cass Sunstein and former White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. In Jean-Pierre's case, that interview was called career-ending and an absolute train wreck. I was sort of shocked by it. Talk about about these interviews. How much do you follow the afterlife of these type of interviews?
In that case, I did the Corinne Jean-Pierre. That yeah, no, I definitely followed that. Just because I guess people were interested in some media organizations reached out for comment about stuff. And I guess I followed the afterlife of that in part because it was the same reason that I did the interview, which is that I was very interested in how, and maybe this gets back to, me being able to express my opinion. I was very interested in how the Biden people were reckoning with what has happened in the last year and what happened in the 6 months before the election. And so I was really interested in that as a subject, which is why I wanted to interview Karine Jean-Pierre and why I read her book and decided to do it. So yeah, no, I definitely followed that one.
So you said your goal isn't to make people look foolish. Are you what does it feel like when you do? Well, because that was a clear in the case of Karine Jean-Pierre, you made her look foolish. But she made herself look foolish. I'm sorry, let me be fair.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I guess I don't think of it as look foolish. I mean, the part of the Sunstein interview that maybe you're referring to or were alluding to is this part about Henry Kissinger, which came up at the end of the interview and his friendship with Henry Kissinger. And I don't think of it as that like Cass Sunstein should look foolish. I thought of it as like, here's a guy who's written a book about liberalism and Henry Kissinger is sort of the figure pre-Trump that I think of as being, if you count his record in places other than America, one of the most illiberal figures in recent American history. And so I wanted to kind of, I wanted to talk about that, and I wanted to sort of bring those two things together in the interview. And it again, it's not to make someone look foolish. It's just I felt that that was an important thing to bring up.
Right, that he had to square that circle,
Yeah,
right?
exactly,
You know,
exactly.
that
And
explain this to me.
we all have contradictions and we all have hypocrisies and
Right.
um they can be uncomfortable to be pushed on, but they're often helpful to be pushed on, I think, not just intellectually in your personal life, whatever else,
Mhm.
because I think it helps, it's good for people to be aware of that since we all have it. And so I thought it was we all
Oh,
have
it's
those. So
fair.
yeah.
It's fair. So you told, in fact, the Columbia Journalism Review, you said if you're asking questions that are meant to highlight contradictions, you have to set them up early in interviews. That was happening to me. And when you know you have a guest where that could be contentions, how do you strategize around that or try to anticipate the way an interview may dig themselves a hole or try to dodge the question? Because some people are good at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets to the question of gotcha questions, which is a phrase I don't like
You don't either.
because okay, good. I, you know, I don't really know what a gotcha question is.
Mhm.
If people have some hypocrisies or contradictions, then they can say, "Yeah, I'm a hypocrite," or they can say, "Yeah, that's a contradiction," or they can explain it, or they can say, "This is why you're wrong about this." But for me, at least, I think highlighting those things is a really interesting way of looking at where people's blind spots are and also where kind of the blind spots of different intellectual traditions or political parties or whatever else is. And so I find that a really interesting thing to focus on. And I think it's important to try and set it up. I mean, I was thinking about this because I did an interview with the French political philosopher Bernard Henri Lévy a number of years ago. And he had written a bunch of stuff about women in the Islamic world and the lack of respect shown to them and why this was an important issue. And I wanted to talk about that, but also I wanted to talk about his support for some Frenchmen who'd been accused of sexual misconduct. I believe it was Roman Polanski and Dominique Strauss-Kahn,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. And so the only way I could think to sort of set this up was asking the questions about women in the Islamic world and what he'd written about them early on, and then bring up the Polanski stuff later on in the interview. And I do think that it has a gotcha feel.
Yes, a callback. Yeah, it's a
Yeah,
callback, right? Yeah.
exactly. But to me, I don't quite know a different way of going about that. And as I said, if he has a response, he's welcome to give it. And but
Right.
to me,
You could ask
that
right after. You could write out, I mean, the next question after
sure,
you set up
sure.
the thing, but you waited.
I waited. Yeah, I can't. I waited because I wanted the interview to kind of have a narrative arc to it. But yeah, no. So I do think about those questions, but generally, I think gotcha questions are fine.
Yeah, but what don't you like about the word gotcha? Because I agree, I don't think they're unfair necessarily,
There's some types of questions I do think are unfair, and I try to stay away from those. But I don't.
such as give me an example.
Um, certain types of personal questions,
Mhm,
people's consensual sexual behavior.
mhm, sure.
I think that I would not ask someone to criticize their place of work or colleagues unless I thought that their place of work or colleagues was doing something, you know, quite horrible, or unethical in some way. I wouldn't say like, I think so and so writer at the New York Times is a bad writer. What do you have to say about that to someone at the New York Times? It's like they're not going to criticize their colleague, nor should they. So something like that. But broadly speaking, that's not what we're talking about.
I have forever lived with I made Mark Zuckerberg sweat, for example, or I made him say dumb things about, anti-Semites, right, or Holocaust deniers specifically. Um, People come back to it again and again. Do you feel that overestimates this assassin idea? I find it tiresome. You made him sweat. You almost made him faint. I'm like, I didn't, but I did. He did sweat. I didn't make him sweat. I mean, it's an interesting thing because it sticks with you. And I wouldn't say it's a bad thing necessarily because it makes people nervous in the beginning. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, most people I interview don't know about me or my work or whatever else. Most people don't read bylines, and I think this is also one of the advantages maybe of doing print interviews rather than, is that uh, I think that people have more of a sense of who you are if you have a podcast or you have a whatever else, and so I don't feel like I'm reckoning with that too often when it comes to actually doing interviews.
Oh, I think people know exactly who you are. I'm sorry. I think they do. They
I,
ask
I
me
think
about.
people in like journalism and stuff do, but
Yeah, I think subjects do.
yeah.
I think your many of the people who work for your subjects certainly do, or PR people certainly do. So every episode we get a question from an outside expert. Here's yours.
Hello, I'm Anna Sale. I'm an interviewer, the host of Death, Sex, and Money. And on our show, I'm often talking to people about things that they haven't talked about at length before with interviewers. And I think of you, Isaac, as someone who is particularly gifted at getting public figures, to talk about things in ways maybe they didn't intend. Um, and I have some questions for you about that. One is just if you approach interviews thinking of that as a goal, to pierce the self presentation of public people for your readers. Um, I also wonder if that's more fun for you when you don't necessarily feel aligned or don't really like the person you're interviewing, if that makes you think a more incisive interviewer, more skeptical interviewer, and thus you get a better interview. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I definitely feel like when I'm talking to public figures or politicians that what I
Mhm.
want to do is get them to say some things that they haven't said a million times before. And one helpful way of doing that is to look at previous interviews that they've given and think like, um, where would I have tried to ask a follow-up that the interviewer didn't? And, same is true for my interviews. Whenever I read them, I think, oh, I should have asked this follow-up and I forgot to, or I didn't. Um, so that's absolutely a goal is to try and get people who I feel like sometimes I'll be thinking during an interview, like, I don't actually say this to people, but sometimes I'll be thinking during an interview, like, if you just repeat the same talking point for 6 times in a row, we're just going to cut it. So why are
Mhm.
you even telling me this?
Mhm.
We've heard this 5 other times in the interview. So
See, I do
that is,
say that. I say
yeah,
that out loud.
there you
But
go.
go ahead.
So yeah, that's definitely a goal.
Mhm. is to get them off of these talking points. And
Yeah.
and what about the, besides piercing the self-presentation, which is talking points, I think that's what she's
Yeah.
talking about. Is it easier when you're not aligned with them, or is it harder? Or is it harder when you are aligned with them?
Oh, I mean, I guess you could say that unconsciously, people you're aligned with, you're probably less aware that they're saying talking points because it's something you agree with, so it seems less propagandistic or whatever else. So I think that's absolutely something that if you're more aligned with someone that you're talking to or you think you are, that it's definitely worth trying to remind yourself that that you may be not paying as close attention as you should to them being propagandistic or saying talking points or whatever else.
But Anna had a second question too. She wanted to know if you have any ridiculous stories of being iced out or intimidated by someone you interviewed or their publicist for including something they wanted taken out in an interview. That's happened to me innumerable times, and I've said no almost to unless it's factually inaccurate.
Yeah, you mean I'm trying to think about, like, I'm sure there are stories. I mean, the most the most intimidated I ever was in an interview was I interviewed the novelist V.S. Naipaul at his house in London, and he was this was pretty early in my interviewing career, and he was quite bullying of me. And I think it actually made for a pretty good interview that because his personality and bullying me the way he kind of did everyone came across. And in fact, I've often thought that, if I had been 10 years older, I might have been less bullied, which may have actually made for a less good interview in that case. But
Bully was interesting. Yeah.
yeah, but that was the most kind of intimidated I'd ever been in or
What
have
did he
ever
do
been.
to bully you? What?
Oh, I mean, he was just, he's a very grumpy guy, and
Mhm.
he would just say, like, "This is a silly question,"
No, yeah, that
or
trick.
he'd
Yeah.
answer a question with nothing. I think nothing about this, that
Mhm.
sort of thing.
Right.
Which for me, and as someone who looked up to him, I got all of his books right behind me on the shelf. Looked up to him a lot, and
Mhm.
still do as a writer, if not as a person.
Right.
Uh, that was definitely hard.
Well, it can also be incisive. I mean, I just had an experience with Kamala Harris where we were joking about something backstage about Robert Kennedy Jr., circumcision and autism, the link. He was making a link, which
Hmm.
is not there. And it was so weird. It was like, huh, that's so fucking strange. And then when I got on stage and mentioned it, because it had just been in the news, right? And she looked at me dead and said, "This is nothing to laugh about." And she had just laughed about it, and then she went into this sort of high-handed kind of thing where she was, like, yelling at me for, like, even asking the question. I was like, "I'm gonna kill you. I literally can't believe you just did that," which was interesting, and I thought it was a real insight,
I sometimes
actually.
get the sense that she doesn't realize her political career is over and,
I don't
thinks she's
know.
still. Yeah, yeah.
It was so funny. I was like, "This where's the person backstage who just had a very insightful comment about this?" Like, it was really an interesting, well, people didn't kn
Perhaps telling about her, electoral performance, yeah.
Yeah, I was like, "Be the person backstage," because that's the person who gave a great answer, actually. Um, one of the things you also do, which I think is interesting, is you summarize what your guests are saying or ask if the summary is accurate, which I think is a power play, actually. You use phrases like, "I'm trying to understand. What specifically do you mean?" Is that strategic? Because I think it's very when I read it, it's very funny. It forces you to have your interviewer say what they're saying is accurate and not go back on that, it seems like, but maybe you're not doing that.
Yeah, no, I think I probably am doing that. Sometimes I am doing that to sort of get them to sort of say upfront what it seems to me that they're hinting at or suggesting, because sometimes they don't wanna say it upfront. I should also say, it's also to go back to the thing about listening to other people. It's like when the interview's going on, you're listening to the other person, but you're also thinking about how much time is left and what else you have to ask, and you're also thinking about, you're thinking about these other things about the context of the interview. So sometimes you don't feel like you actually got exactly and you want to be clear. And so that's often the case too. Maybe I'm telling on myself by saying that, I want to, not totally sure what the other person said, but because you're trying to do a million things at once, that's definitely the case.
Do you ever decide it's time to back off either because your guest clearly doesn't have a good answer or you need to move on or they're getting upset? Do you get rattled by that? I do not. I don't mind them getting upset in front of me or being upset or being rude back at me.
I don't mind rudeness. am I trying to think?
Like, that's a dumb question. Like, that drives me crazy. That makes me double down.
Oh no, no, this goes again. I think if more stuff was in person, it might shake me more, but over the phone, it doesn't really. Um, but yeah, several times, people have been kind of, but it's again to go back. Most of the time, these interviews are not particularly. I mean, the two you brought up, Cass Sunstein and Karine Jean-Pierre. I think Karine Jean-Pierre felt that she and I were not seeing eye to eye about some of the things she was saying, but the interview didn't feel tense, and neither did the Cass Sunstein one at all. So
They
I
read
think
tense.
yeah, I think that. Uh, it's interesting. I mean, I sometimes think the interviews read more tense than they are, or sometimes maybe it's that I just have more of a tolerance for being uncomfortable in a phone conversation than other people. They don't feel that way to me usually, even when they read that way. Um, so I don't know. It's a good question. I should think more about that.
Are you ever surprised when if you didn't think that was a tense one and then everyone was like, "Oh my fucking God," like that kind of
Well,
thing?
no, I guess what I mean is that it's like, you could get into a debate with someone and, then shake hands afterwards and it doesn't feel tense and sometimes it does. And I guess just sometimes like Corinne Jean-Pierre, it didn't feel particularly um I thought she was very polite answering the questions, and even though I was asking somewhat aggressive questions, it didn't read. There have been interviews that I've done that did actually feel tense.
Like who? Like who was?
Newt Gingrich once when I interviewed
Oh, he's a
him.
pain in the ass.
Yeah, a couple kind of Trumpish people.
Mhm.
You know, one thing about what's happening in the world now with Trump and what's happening in the country is, in my opinion, it's all these things. It's horrific and it's depressing and so on, but it's also ridiculous. And a lot of the people defending him in public are ridiculous. And there's only so much you can do about this that's dead serious, where it's like arguing that the earth is flat. And so I try and sometimes those interviews that I feel like would be more tense with those types of people to try and make them funny because, or tongue in cheek, whatever, because, as I said, there's only so much you can get at
Right,
pounding
you
the
don't wanna
ground.
take the flat earth thing seriously, is what you're saying.
Well, I'm not even saying that. It's
Mm.
like, it's more just that, like, it's just not that interesting to read people arguing about whether the earth is flat.
Right, right.
And there's something so absurd about it.
You have a reputation of being critical of other journalists. I agree that journalists should be more critical of each other. They sometimes tend not to. But you were in a fight on X with Semaphore's Ben Smith, who is a disputatious person, over the outlet's coverage of the Saudi crown prince on the outlet's Gulf vertical. You wrote on X, quote, "You would have to be brain dead to read this piece and not immediately wonder who is funding Semaphore Gulf." Smith criticized you for the insinuation the post was sponsored content. I'm with you on that one. I've had that argument with him off screen. What do you talk about why you do this? I often get into fights with reporters sometimes. But what are you hoping to highlight there? Just the obvious?
You mean why I will criticize
Yeah.
other reporters sometimes?
Yeah.
Geez. It's a good question. Probably, I mean, sometimes it's probably just being dumb, but I think I spend a good chunk of my day complaining to my friends about articles I didn't like or whatever. It's just kind of how I engage with the world. And I think it sort of gives me some, you know, it kind of it's a way of engaging with the world. I don't know. It's probably too critical a way of engaging with the world, but it's a way I kind of engage with the world. And because, maybe my pop psychological explanation of this would be that, media tends to listen to other media criticism, I feel like, whereas, uh, you know, I mean, I wouldn't do this for various reasons, but, I could tweet out that, I'm upset about what's happening in, Sudan or Gaza or wherever else, Ukraine, and nobody cares, nobody's paying attention. It feels like, with journalists, they pay attention to what other journalists say, and I hope, I certainly I take criticism from other journalists and take it seriously, and hopefully other journalists do too. So maybe it's a way of feeling like you can actually be heard in a way that you can't in other ways.
Yeah, possibly, possibly. They're
There's also, and this is not about the Ben Smith stuff. There's just, there's a lot of terrible journalism out there, and
mhm.
it seems worth paying attention to,
Pointing out.
making it
Pointing
better.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A part of the reason you get into media is because you're interested in engaging with it, and you want it to be good. And we all have like our mini dramas with the newspapers and magazines we've been reading for 25 years, and we want them to be better, and we love them, and whatever else.
So journalists face a lot of challenge, though, when it comes to access right now. It's absolutely true. As you noted, politicians and other powerful people can choose to sit down with friendly media outlets, which they're doing, like extremely, or else they don't need it at all. Like it's direct to customer, essentially. But do you think that's going to be the case all the time, that they'll find their friendlies and the people will just do it by themselves or edit things out? Does that make it more difficult to land these interviews in this climate? How do you hold powerful people to account when they're competing against influencers and these partisan outlets? Because it's a lot easier for them to do that, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a good answer. I'm not optimistic about it.
Meaning,
Oh, I mean, I think what you said is accurate, and it's going to be harder and harder to get access, and you know, uh, that I think is a real problem.
who have you recently gone for that you haven't been able to get? Marjorie Taylor Greene, in our case. I think she doesn't want, because I've said explicitly, I'm going to ask her about the other things. Like, I agree with her on a couple of things, but let's ask about trans again. Let's ask about this. And I'm sure the PR people have heard me say it. Like, why isn't anyone asking her about the other 93 things has heinous opinions on? Like, because she happens to be reasonable about 5, that we can all agree with, which seem to be the lowest bar of all time. I appreciate her doing them, but at the same time, it doesn't negate all the other things she said, essentially.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I was just going through a bunch of Republican senators who I'd been trying to get at various times and haven't had any luck with that. And I mean, I've stopped trying as much as I used to, just because it's just so hard to get Republican politicians.
Who would you love to get, for example? Who have you not been able to get? She's one of them. I'm certain it's
Well,
because,
Kissinger died. He was number
yeah,
one on my list.
you could still do that interview.
I could. I
Yeah,
could.
yeah. Talk to the
Uh,
corpse.
Talk to the corpse. Yeah. Um, Narendra Modi is someone who I've tried to get for a long time. Not going to
Mhm.
happen. So I'm trying to think of people that I really would like to get that I've not been able to get. Tony Blair is one.
You're not missing much.
Fair. So yeah, there have been. I'm trying to think though. Who else? I was able to interview Imran Khan, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. So that was interesting. He was on my list. People I really wanted to talk to. I don't know. Sean Connery's dead. My list is quickly getting smaller.
Right. Is there anybody that your number one person? People always
I
ask me
think
that.
Modi would be number one, but
Really? Why? Why Modi?
I just I'm very interested in India. Travel there a lot, and written about it some, and so he's always interested me.
Gosh, mine is
Um,
Dolly Parton and Taylor Swift together, but okay.
okay,
Yeah,
well,
together, only talking about business, nothing else. Nothing else.
Dolly Parton, yeah,
Because
Taylor
I think
Swift.
they're business people. I think we don't talk about their business acumen as much as we talk
Yeah,
about
that's
their
interesting. I
songs.
I I don't know anything about either one of them, I'm sorry to say.
That's okay. That's all right. You'll probably get them before I will. Journalists are under a ton of pressure from executives who are looking to appease the Trump administration right now. There's example after example. Last month, CBS News editor-in-chief Barry Weiss spiked a 60 Minutes segment on Venezuelan deportees who were sent to a maximum security prison in El Salvador. Weiss defended her decision and denied politics played a role, saying she wanted to improve the piece. Some of her suggestions were fine. I don't think necessary, but fine. But the timing was certainly odd, and she changed her opinion in the middle of it, right? CBS is owned by Paramount, which is owned by David Ellison. He and his father, Larry, are currently trying to buy Warner Brothers Discovery, which owns CNN. Any deal would need regulatory approval. They have touted the fact that they will be able to get it easily, publicly, and quite officiously, I think. What do you talk about those pressures right now, and what worries you most? I assume you've never had that pressure. I have not, that I can think of, even working for Rupert Murdoch. Talk a little bit about what the moment is right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fortunate to not have had those pressures either. I had when I worked at the New Republic, we had a owner who was crazy and bigoted, and not a Marty Peretz was his name. Uh and not a very nice guy, and so there were pressures that came down, but it wasn't of the sort that you're referring to. Yeah, it's really bleak and depressing times, and I think that the Trump White House has very smartly understood that the way to sort of exert some pressure on the media is not to you know, not to do what he did in his first term, which is just sort of berate people, but to, make regulatory approvals conditional on, kissing the ring or whatever else. And I think that that's definitely very scary and, yeah, depressing. I wish I had something more interesting to say about it. I mean, it's bleak and it's quite worrisome.
Do you, if you, that was presented to you, if you were Sharon Alphonse, for example, what would you do?
Um,
She
I
wrote a
mean,
really terrific memo, obviously.
yeah, I mean, I think it's incumbent on journalists if they feel that they are being censored for political reasons to, essentially go public with it. I think that that's the smartest, I mean, without specifically weighing in on exactly, what we know and don't know about that situation. I mean, I think there's a broad matter. That's absolutely the way to go about it is to sort of go public.
So
Um,
in that controversy, because it's the most
yeah,
recent,
sure.
which one of the people would you want to interview?
Oh, I mean, all of them. I mean, Alfonsi probably less than Barry Weiss or David Ellison, but just because I feel like Alfonsi's perspective is clear. But yeah, Barry Weiss or David Ellison. I mean, David Ellison, I think, is a very interesting figure, and would definitely enjoy interviewing him.
See, I would pick Larry Ellison because he's the
Yeah, I was
smart
about to
one.
say Larry. Actually, I should have
Larry.
that would have been a good answer. He does the dyeing his goatee thing, which I find
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. He's a character. I've interviewed him many times, but he's the brains of the operation, as far as I can tell.
And do you perceive that he has actual deep interest in Paramount acquiring Warner Brothers, or do you feel like you don't?
I was actually out with a bunch of people last night, and we all know him really well, and we're sort of surprised that he's continuing at all because it's such a nothing business for him, for someone like him. And so I think he's trying to please his son. I don't even know. I'd have to ask him. I'd love to know, like, why.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is something that, maybe one of my colleagues at the magazine will do, but a sort of profile of that father-son dynamic seems psychologically rich, to say the least.
Yes, absolutely. It's so dumb for him. Like, this is a dumb deal, and it's dumb after. If he gets it, it's dumb. And so, like, he never does dumb things, really. So you're like, why are you doing this dumb thing? So anyway, it's interesting. I want to end by looking at some of the big stories coming in the new year. In 2025, you wrote a lot about the Middle East and the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And Trump recently met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to talk more about the war in Gaza, Syria, Iran, and more. Officially, a ceasefire with Hamas is holding, but both sides have been accused other of violating it. Negotiations around the second phase have stalled. And Trump and Netanyahu are reportedly at odds over what happens next, although they affirmed their bond during this latest meeting. Where do you see that relationship heading in the next year, and what could it mean for the ongoing conflict in Gaza? And who would you think is important to talk to for this?
Yeah, I mean, there is going to be an election in Israel later in this year, so that will be interesting, which is an important election for Netanyahu, variety of reasons having to do with his trial of corruption trial and political legacy and so on. In terms of that relationship, I thought that what happened at the White House earlier this week was indicative of it, in the sense that, Trump is shown a willingness to push Netanyahu and the Israelis in short-term ways. Um, Especially earlier in 2025, about coming to some sort of ceasefire in Gaza, even though, as you say, it hasn't exactly held. It's held in some ways, but certainly not in others. People are still dying. To me, what that sort of showed was that I think Netanyahu, and I think this is true of Putin to some extent too, correctly perceives that he can sort of make a somewhat of an effort to act as if he is going to do what Trump wants, but there's never quite enough follow through. And so Netanyahu can sort of keep getting what he wants from Trump, which I assume is continuation of the American-Israeli relationship, support for Netanyahu politically, and dragging his feet on any sort of long-term solution in Gaza. And like I said, I think Putin correctly perceives that this is the case too, that he can sort of make noises about peace or call Trump once every few weeks and, you know, therefore keep up the pressure on the Ukrainians without having to truly commit to a peace deal. And so I think this is a smart way to deal with Trump in both cases. And I think it's what we'll sort of continue to see, some version of the status quo dragging on and on and on.
And who do you think an important interview during this time is? If they would do it, what would be the most important?
Well, I mean, maybe this gets to what we're a version of what we were talking about earlier. I don't know if this is a great answer, but I'm just more interested in terms of, just to mention Ukraine and Gaza, two ongoing conflicts. I'm less interested about White House decision making and talking to the principals there than I think I would have been. I think part of the reason I've been interested in talking to Biden people in the last year about Gaza policy is that um, it felt their policy, which was left a lot to be desired, in my opinion. It was interesting to talk through how they were thinking about it in a way that I'm just sort of I want to read investigative stories. Like, I want to read investigative stories about the Trump administration's business deals in the Middle East or Steve Witkoff's business deals in in Eastern Europe. I'm less interested in sort of hearing from principals, talking to Marco Rubio about how he's thinking about Gaza. That sort of interview in the Trump administration just feels completely null and uninteresting to me.
Yeah, yeah. Although I think Witkoff would be interesting.
Witkoff would be interesting. Witkoff would be interesting. I
Here's
agree.
why: is he dumb? He seems dumb. So I'd like to know. I'd like to talk to him to find out. Like, essentially, how dumb is he? Because that's what you get from people. Or a Lutnick. Is he a moron? Because people say moron to me a lot when talking about his friends, actually, which I'm always like, I'd
I
like
find
to.
this with all conversations. The reason I want to talk to people is to find out if they're dumb. So
They're
yeah.
dumb. That's right. So far, you're smart. Next year is also an election year within the Democratic Party. There are primaries pitting more establishment candidates against progressives. I'm thinking of Senate primaries in Maine, Michigan, Minnesota. There's a lot of issues that Democrats have not resolved that divided them in the wake of the 2024 election. Is there areas you're interested in probing with the Democrats?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested in kind of this generational and ideological divide that seems to be showing up or will show up in certain primaries. Maine Senate race being an example of that. Obviously, some of these questions showed up in the New York mayoral election. And I'm just interested in broader questions about, where the Democrats should be going, what is the right political strategy, how they're going to go about winning races in purple or red states for the Senate, which they're going to have to start doing if they want to ever get the Senate back. I think my gut feeling is that these issues are kind of going to be largely papered over in 2026 because it's an off-year election and the president's party usually suffers defeats, and that Democrats, whatever they do, are probably going to have a pretty good election. But I think for the 2028 primary, these issues will certainly come to the fore in a more kind of urgent way.
Is there anyone you're very intrigued by at this moment?
Uh,
I just have to
my-
talk to this person.
oh, God, you keep asking me if there's
Mhm.
anyone I feel like I have to talk to, and I realize I don't have good answers for these
It is-
questions. Most of the people I consider the leading candidates for the Democratic nomination, if you were just to look at the like Vegas odds for, I think they're all pretty interesting as possible interview. Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro,
Mhm,
Ocasio-Cortez, whoever, these people. I think all of them are pretty interesting, actually.
mhm. Have you interviewed Gavin Newsom?
No.
He would be good with Gavin Newsom.
Hmm.
I'd read the hell out of that, I'll tell
My
you.
colleague, Tad Friend, wrote a profile of him
Mhm,
in 2018, I think, for
mhm.
The New Yorker, which I think of as like one of the most brutal pieces I've ever read.
It is. He's a complex person.
Yeah.
He's very interesting, though, I'll tell you that. Boy, and much more so. I always tell him he's really interesting for a handsome person. Often they aren't as interesting as less handsome people, but he is very handsome and very interesting. Couple last question. I have actually two last questions. There's many more big stories from 2025 that will carry over into the year. You mentioned Russia's war in Ukraine. As is recording, there's no peace deal despite some recent activity. There's also the AI race in China, Trump's expansion of presidential authority, political violence, escalating tensions with Venezuela, a grueling civil war in Sudan. Obviously, the end of Trump himself. It's moving in that direction very clearly. What are the big questions you have heading into the year?
I mean, I would say that Ukraine and Gaza are two things, but beyond that, I think, yeah, we touched on this earlier about the question of what's going to happen. There's the next president he's going to be making regulatory decisions based on, how much people come and kiss up to him. Just, where the country's headed seems like, in some ways the big question. And that's a question of where the Republican Party's headed. And, I think the kind of question, at least in my mind, that hangs over kind of everything, I feel like I think about this in some version, every 20 minutes is like, once Trump is no longer on the scene or once he's no longer president, like, is the country going to revert to some sort of normalcy in whatever that meant pre-Trump? And I don't know the answer, but there's so many ways in which I think about that. And it's also related to the question of just, Trump is certainly unique in most ways, but there are, similar politicians or politicians with similar kind of ideological affiliations winning across the globe, and how much is that sort of a permanent thing or not? So I think those two questions, I think, definitely interest me. It's something I've talked a lot about in interviews, done a lot of interviews about, and so I think that sort of hangs over most of the intellectual questions I have about where we're headed.
What next is what you're essentially saying.
Yeah.
What next? So that sort of was the last question. You're doing the exit interview with Trump. He picks you. What would be your first or your last question for him? You get to pick.
Well, I'll just say I don't know. I don't know, but I will answer that question by saying I've often thought about what I would do if I interviewed Trump, and I don't know what I would do. But I think the one thing that I've thought of would be interesting is just to choose one small subject and just ask him a million questions about that subject. Whether it would sort of be like Trump and race or Trump and women or Trump and his parents, and just to sort of go in on one specific thing, and to steer clear of what was in the news that day or whatever else, and hope that by kind of nailing down, you could get something, and focus him in a way by asking the same question about the same subject. Because I think that there's something about the kind of what's the words I'm looking for? Sort of
Repetitive.
hyper. Well, just when there's so many questions and you're asking him so many questions and he's switching subjects all the time.
Right.
Anyway, this probably would not work. I'm almost sure it would not work, but it was the only idea I had for how to make
That's a
Trump
good
interview
one.
interesting.
Yeah. Drill down on one thing. I think my first question would be, did your parents hug you enough? Do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely
He
definitely
would
a question
freak
that,
out. It would
yeah.
unsettle him right away. Actually, I'm gonna ask one last question. Tell me something personal about yourself that people don't know.
Okay. I'm a big Houston Rockets fan, and
Riveting.
yeah, sorry about that one, but no, I'm a big Houston Rockets fan and very very anxious fan. Don't handle my emotions well about it. So yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll start with that next time.
Yeah,
Next time.
please.
I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Anyway, Isaac, I'm a huge fan. I really appreciate your time, and I'm excited to read your interviews over the next year.
Thank you so much, Kara.
Today's show was produced by Christian Castro-Russell, Michelle Alloy, Megan Burney, and Kaylin Lynch. Nishat Kurwa is Vox Media's executive producer of podcasts. Special thanks to Sheena Ozaki, Bradley Sylvester, and Madeline LaPlante Doobie. And our theme music is by Trackademics. If you're already following the show, you're an interview assassin. If not, you're on your talking points. Get off of them. Thanks for watching. See you on Thursday.